The mood shattered, he hastily rolled up the scroll. "What is it?" A young boy's head cautiously poked inside.
"Sir, there's dinner downstairs."
Elijah slid the damaged scroll back into his bag.
"Thank you, no. I'll be there in a second."
He wandered downstairs to catch the wafting yeast and honey scent of fresh bread mingled with the rich, meaty smell of cooked lamb. The whole family was waiting for him at a long, low table with cushions for seats. There were a lot of them. 3 young sons and 2 daughters, a matronly grandmother, a cordial lady of the house, and of course Saul, the man of the house, a jovial, middle-aged fellow who sometimes got a little too deep in his wine. Elijah found a spot and bowed as the blessing was said. He'd almost forgotten how hungry he was and was quick to start on the delicious food. Saul was eager to hear about his progress, getting the delivery terms for his crops finished up, and Elijah was explaining that he'd likely finish tomorrow, when there came a heavy pounding on the door and a gruff voice.
"Open up, in the name of His Majesty the King."
Elijah's heart froze in his chest at the words, and Saul muttered a curse. He hadn't exactly been subtle during his time here in Tanakh, and part of the reason Saul had offered to let him stay and work was because his family followed God too.
"Go!"
He sharply gestured Elijah toward the stairs.
"Out the window. I'll stall him."
He stood and headed for the door as the fist pounded yet again. Elijah bolted for his room while, behind him, Saul's wife quickly cleared his spot at the table so no one would suspect a guess. Darting into his room, Elijah jammed the few things he still had into his bag and peered out the window into the night. It was a 4 or 5 pace drop down to the packed dirt along the side of the house. There wasn't much room in the narrow side alley. Only a few cubits gap separating it from the next house over. But from there, he could possibly vanish into the rest of the town until morning. He crawled out the windowsill until he was hanging down along the outer wall, with just his hands holding on. Flickering torchlight suddenly spilled down the narrow alley, and a loud shout, "Captain! Round here!" In a swell of panic, his hand slipped loose and he tumbled to the ground below. The impact jarred his legs and left a sharp sting in one foot. The light was closing in behind him, but Elijah ran away. He got all of 3 steps before someone tackled him like a ball from behind, sending the young prophet crashing to the ground. He desperately tried to kick off his attacker, but in a moment the soldier had his arms pinned behind him like a vice, shoving his face in the dirt.
"Got him!"
Elijah's breaths came in short, frantic pants as more footsteps thudded behind him. He twisted his head until he could see the whole squad of King's guards gathering around him, their spear points glinting like razors in the torchlight.
"Get him up!"
the leader commanded. Several pairs of hands pulled him upright, face to face with the guard commander. A stocky man in a studded leather jerkin, and the only one to carry an expensive sword at his side.
"Are you the one called Elijah?"
he demanded, his eyes narrowing and his hand sliding toward his blade. Elijah swallowed hard. He'd always known they might catch him, but he'd imagined putting up a slightly more glorious struggle than almost breaking his legs and getting tackled in a back alley.
"The people inside, they didn't know. I don't care about them."
The commander cut him off, his voice acrid.
"Are you Elijah the prophet?"
His eyes darted back to the man's sword. This was so unfair. He'd just taken a huge step of faith, praying for no rain, and this was the response he got. It didn't make any sense. He'd run over this scenario 100 times in his head, though, and despite the cold fear strangling his chest, he forced the words out.
"Yes, I am."
He pressed his eyes shut and winced, expecting the agonizing bite of sharpened iron in his gut. After a long moment, though, nothing happened. He inched his eyes open to see the guard commander staring at him like he was a moron.
"Take him back to the post,"
he ordered with a flick of his hand.
"We'll move out at first light."
It took Elijah a second to process they weren't about to murder him right on the spot, but when it did, he let out a breath he hadn't even realized he was holding.
"What? Where are we going?"
The commander's voice was sharp, like even deigning to answer was a trial.
"Jezreel."
Jezreel, the fortress city of King Ahab.
Whatever relief he'd felt of retaining his life evaporated as he realized what that meant. His execution was still on the horizon. He'd just have a bit longer to dread it. King Ahab of Israel lounged back in his chair and sipped at a silver goblet, savoring the red wine, a product of his own vineyard right here at Jezreel. He'd come to the city to oversee the ongoing construction of several new towers, and had gotten a pleasant surprise as his news this morning. It was shaping up to be an excellent day. So, where did they find him, Obadiah?
Tanakh, sir, his steward replied. They found him yesterday evening and brought him first thing this morning.
Tanakh, he mused. What is that, 3 hours walk? They made good time. Before Obadiah could answer, he nodded toward the door. Go get him.
In here, sir? Obadiah asked, surprised.
Just bring him in. Obadiah nodded, and Ahab settled back on his throne. Normally, he would have passed sentence from his throne at the city gate, but he could always do that later. Right now, he wanted to meet this odd prophet who'd been popping up all over his kingdom for the last several months. He could save the judgment until after inspecting the royal stables this afternoon. Meeting this Elijah in public would just cause more problems. Plus, Jezebel would show up. As it was, she was busy with her handmaidens doing something. Frankly, it was better that way. She'd probably be all off with his head. And really, he just wanted to talk for a minute. Besides, this Elijah hadn't made any particularly grim pronouncements against him yet. Maybe there was an easier way to solve all this. The carved cedar doors to his chamber swung open, and Obadiah strode in at the head of 2 guards, escorting a man who hardly looked a day over 30.
Elijah the prophet, sir.
The steward bowed and gestured Elijah forward. So, Ahab regarded him. You're the Elijah I've heard so much about. I don't suppose you know who I am? Elijah hesitated, his answer cautious. You are King Ahab of Israel. Indeed. Ahab noticed, with a twinge of annoyance, that Elijah didn't bother to bow. A lot of the prophets seemed to be sticklers about that. Yet another reason he hadn't done all this down at the city gate. Here, he could ignore protocol if he wanted. I want to talk, Ahab said, about this god of yours. The bewildered confusion on the young prophet's face almost made the king chuckle. What do you mean? I mean, I'm tired of his followers constantly harassing me. I was hoping we could come to some sort of understanding. If you want to worship him, that's fine. I prefer Baal, but I can definitely offer a few sacrifices to your god if that would please him. I can even offer you a position as a palace priest if the sacrifices need to be done in some particular fashion. He had been hoping the prophet would accept his olive branch. Normally that sort of thing did wonders to deal with discontent. It was amazing how people just wanted an easy job, a room at the palace, and an important-sounding title. Elijah froze at the offer. Ahab suspected he'd been marched in expecting a summary hearing, followed by an execution. Clearly, the prophet hadn't anticipated anything like this, and for a long moment his mouth hung open, a half-inch, considering the offer. Elijah took a deep breath. I don't think that's something that would appease the Lord. Ahab felt a flash of frustrated anger. Well, what would? He demanded. What do I have to do to get your God to leave me alone? Elijah visibly swallowed, a nervous look on his face. Ahab guessed he wouldn't like the answer. If you cut down the Asherah pools, tear down the altars to Baal, and destroy the golden calves at Bethel and Dan. That's not going to happen, Ahab snapped, his fist unconsciously tightening at the trumped-up prophet's obstinacy. Why does it even matter? He threw up his hands. Why does your God care if I worship Baal? Does he need a certain number of prayers? I can arrange that. He doesn't need prayers, Elijah tried to explain.
Then why does he seem to be so insistent that everyone worship him? Cut